a very, very warm welcome to this Green Alliance seminar on water quality and the future possible policy for water in England and Wales. Now, my name is Sarah Mukherjee and I will be your host for today, and we have a fantastic panel of speakers and I know a lot of interest in this seminar, so we're going to make sure we have as much time as possible for your questions and debate after we've heard from our very distinguished panel of speakers. Now, according to campaigners and environmental NGOs, rivers are struggling, polluted, with wildlife disappearing and pollution from sewage, chemical and agricultural waste, all meaning most rivers are not legally fit to swim in. Targets have been agreed through the Environment Act, but are they really resilient? And there is consensus building for catchment partnerships to drive action regionally, but do they have the necessary governance and resources to deliver? How do we link local nature recovery strategies to ensure there is proper action to improve water quality and quality for nature as well? Well, as I said, joining us are a fantastic group of speakers who will be discussing this and also taking your questions as well. So hold yourself in readiness. We'll be taking those a little later on. Ali Morse, who is Water Policy Manager at the Wildlife Trusts, Amy Slack, Campaigns Manager at River Action, and Alistair Chisholm, who's Director of Policy at the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management, or CWEM. And I think we'll start with Ali, Water Policy Manager at the Wildlife Trusts, for your thoughts on this incredibly important subject. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. I've been asked to set the scene by thinking a little about the legal and policy framework and how it can help us to drive continual improvement in the state of our waters. I'm going to speak primarily from an England perspective, but a lot of what I say will have wider relevance. We have a substantial body of legislation, of regulation, of policy, ultimately given effect through a series of plans that affect the water environment. And we have a large number of these: water resources management plans, drought plans, diffuse water pollution plans, flood risk management plans, and so on. I Googled collective nouns, and one of the suggestions was a paralysis. There are certainly some who think that we have in place all the plans, all the policy that we need to drive improvement for our water environment, and we just need to get on with delivery. But I think it is legitimate to look at the suite of policy and legislation that we have in order to consider whether there are things within that body or missing from that body that are preventing us delivering for our waters in the best possible way. So the approach that we take is to deliver for our water environment under a framework of the Water Framework Directive. This was an EU directive that we were instrumental in helping to put in place when we were part of the EU, and which we have brought across the key requirements of into our own legislation through the Water Environment WFD regulations. And this framework approach is really helpful in that it sets out not only the ambitions for our water environment, but also how we can use other bits of legislation to help us deliver those. So, for example, when we are considering the environmental permitting regimes in granting abstraction licenses or discharge consents, we need to, within that piece of legislation, take account of the targets set under the Water Framework Directive regs in order to make sure that we're driving the health of our water environment. So this holistic approach, this framework approach, has been really important for a number of reasons. It's firstly encouraged us to think about the health of our waters in a much wider, much more holistic way. We primarily used to consider water health in terms of pollution, in terms of water quality. But now, alongside the chemical status, we also consider the ecological status, the health of the ecology, our waters as an ecosystem. It requires us to put in place a comprehensive programme of monitoring so that we understand the pressures affecting our waters, and that we use that information to develop a programme of measures. So these are the series of actions in river basin management plans that we need to deliver in order to achieve the objectives that we've set for our waters. It encourages us to take a catchment-based approach. And this is not only inherently sensible in terms of being a sensible geography at which to approach the issues affecting our waters, but it's also important in terms of facilitating the involvement of local stakeholders in driving behaviour change. We know that that local level understanding and engagement is really helpful. And finally, it thinks about the value to society. So the objectives that are set under the Water Framework regs are based upon a cost-benefit analysis, which includes the value of a healthy water environment to society. So this means that the changes that we're trying to drive are well justified and defendable. I'm not saying that any of these measures are completely perfect in the way that they currently operate, but they do give us a really good basis. So some dates to think about: the default ambition for putting our waters into good chemical and good ecological status, so good overall status, and also for bringing some of our protected areas to good health, things like SACs and SPAs under the original directive, was 2015. That was the default ambition. But within that, there were a number of exemptions. You could take longer to bring your waters to health if it was too costly to do so by that first date, or if it was technically infeasible. And so we have later ambitions of 2021 and 2027. Now, based on where we are now, that remaining date ambition, 2027, is coming pretty fast. And that was the date that was set under the river basin management plans that were published for England just before Christmas, for a large number of water bodies to bring the ecological status to good status by 2027. The river basin management plans set out the actions that we need to take in order to do this, but the level of confidence that was attributed to that ambition was set as low confidence for the vast majority of those 2027 dates. And the reason, or perhaps one of the reasons for this, is that we don't have a good ability to sort of spatially target and spatially prioritize the actions that we need to deliver to bring our waters to good health. So, for example, we know agricultural water pollution is a key pressure on many of our water bodies, but the environmental land management scheme that could be a really valuable format for driving some of the action to make these improvements, it's a voluntary scheme, and we don't yet know the detail of how measures within it will be spatially prioritized. There are also other shortcomings. We know that other agencies who have to have regard to river basin management plans when they're undertaking certain activities. Is that a strong enough driver? The fact that many of our protected sites, which should, as you'll remember, have been in good condition by 2015, are currently suffering with nutrient pollution, and we have to implement nutrient neutrality to try and bring them back to health, suggests that we really haven't been proactive enough with the way that we protect our waters from these kinds of pressures. The other key date in those plans, 2063, is the date by which we expect our waters to come to good chemical status. And the reason for that is that many of the chemicals in our water environment are very persistent. Once they're in our waters, it's really difficult to do a lot about them. And so that's the time it will take for our waters to naturally recover from these pollutants. But that headline is masking the detail below. There are a whole number of other chemicals, and can we understand if we're doing enough to tackle those? Have we put in place the actions to reduce the pollution by the chemicals that we can do something about? So looking forward, where might this go? Well, in our regulations, the requirement to undertake a 6-yearly economic analysis and to publish river basin management plans is an ongoing requirement. So that 2027 date isn't the end of things. And we might see, for example, a helpful evolution of the cost-benefit analysis that could see us justifying more investment in the water environment. For example, thinking about the health and well-being benefits that our waters can provide. Could that see us undertaking more improvements in urban environments close to people, where people live, where large numbers of people could benefit from those improvements? So to conclude, I think many of the components are there, that catchment-based approach, those benefits that that our water environment can bring, but we need to see these evolving over time in order to facilitate greater action and faster action to bring our waters back to health.
Brilliant, Ali. Thank you so much. Thanks for kicking us off with a great tour d'horizon there of the public, regulatory and policy landscapes. Really good foundation for the discussion. I'd like now to hand the virtual baton over to Amy Slack, who is campaigns manager at River Action, and she leads the organisation's public campaign and political advocacy work. Amy, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. So I've been asked to speak or to provide some opening remarks on the growing public concern and expectations on river health. And I think it's fair to say, and probably blindingly obvious, that the public are rightly outraged by what's happening to our rivers. I think many people expect the UK, which many of us would regard as a developed country, to have healthy rivers, not to be treating them as open sewers. But unlike other parts of the world, there's, well, the problem is often open and clear to see. In the UK, it's become a bit of a dirty secret that's in most part been hidden both physically below the ground and on our fields, and largely kept under wraps by those in power. I think there's some water company bosses out there who would have us believe that it's not until recently that their customers have cared about water pollution. But I don't think it's because we don't care. I think it's because we really haven't known what's been going on. People don't know that decades of deregulation of the water sector has essentially allowed monitoring and enforcement of themselves. Don't know that toxic levels of agricultural manure and slurry have been streaming into our rivers from conveniently enclosed intensive livestock farms, and don't know that huge cuts to regulators' budgets have been crippling their ability to hold polluters to account. What has changed hugely in the last 3 years is the exposure to the issue, and that's largely driven as a result of the availability of data and people really digging into it. It's through things like Surfers Against Sewage's Safer Seas and Rivers Service app that tells us when and where sewage is being discharged into bathing waters in real time. It's the Rivers Trust Sewage Map, the Top of the Poops website, that exposes annual sewage data in a way that is really easy to understand and dig into. And it's the work of community groups like Windrush Against Sewage Pollution digging into illegal sewage discharges from wastewater treatment plants. And all that has led to the huge exposure of the sewage scandal. But what I think is much less known about is what's going on in terms of agricultural pollution, which is arguably the biggest contributor to the pollution of our waterways. There's not really any data, or there's not much data that can be scrutinised into the true impact of agricultural pollution on rivers. We are, however, starting to see a bit of public spotlight shone on that agenda through documentaries like Riverside, exposing agricultural pollution killing the River Wye, and most recently, of course, as part of the Paul Whitehouse documentary on the BBC over the last couple of weeks. And I think we'll start to see a steady increase in public attention of that issue over the coming months and coming years. And it's become such a high-profile mainstream issue because it affects all of us, regardless of where you come or who you vote for. The pandemic has highlighted to many the value of nature and the environment for both both physical and mental health. We've seen huge growth in the participation of outdoor sports, particularly on our waterways, with massive booms in wild swimming and paddleboarding. And we expect to be able to access water that is essentially not making us sick or killing the environment. We don't expect big businesses to be profiteering out of polluting these precious and loved environments, particularly when we're facing a cost of living crisis, of course. And now what we're seeing is people and communities up and down the country that have essentially had enough of the failures of government are taking action into their own hands. Communities are using the bathing water status in an attempt to force the monitoring and improvements of waterways on their local rivers. We've seen this week, four applications go through for consideration, but unfortunately 5 rejected, through a rather opaque assessment mechanism. And we're seeing an army of citizen scientists monitoring water quality for both human and ecological health that's further exposing the truth behind the state of our rivers. A recent poll by RSPB, National Trust and WWF last September asked respondents to select what they most want to see in their local area to improve nature and wildlife. And the #1 response was more action for cleaner rivers, waterways and seas. And we can see the impact of this huge public pressure. Doesn't seem to be a week that goes by now without the mention of river pollution in Parliament. And I think we'll see the state of our rivers gearing up to be a major election issue as we move into next year. Water company bosses are now at least admitting that there's a problem, and businesses like Avara Foods are actually starting to admit culpability for agricultural pollution. But I'd really question whether the dial is shifting fast enough to rescue our rivers. So before I hand the virtual mic back to Sarah, I just want to finish by reminding us all that rivers are being drowned in pollution. This is an emergency, and we really must act with a lot of urgency.
Do you know, a little thing saying unmute to start speaking, that really is such a 101 error, isn't it, these days? Really should have got with the programme on that. So £10 in the charity box to me, hooray. Thanks so much, Amy, and thanks for that really passionate and very clear call to arms and call to action. Talking of which, I should remind our audience, which is in 3 figures, I noticed, which is fantastic. If you've got any questions, any comments, please start popping them in the chat so we can start picking those up and put them to our panelists, and also maybe discuss them more widely as well and raise some comments, because I know there is a lot of passion, understood, quite understandable passion and interest around this incredibly important subject. Talking of which, on to our final panelists for today, Alistair Chisholm, from the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. He's Director of Policy and has huge experience. I haven't gone into everybody's CVs because they've all got amazing CVs, and it would have been half the session. So, but he has huge experience spanning many years on water policy and multidisciplinary policy work. So Alistair, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks very much. So I've been asked to give some comments on some of the challenges that are being faced in terms of infrastructure delivery and investment relating to improving water quality. And what this really is speaking to is tackling the problem of sewage pollution. So following the Environment Act and the Storm Overflows Reduction Plan that followed that act, Ofwat and the Environment Agency updated their guidance to water companies on plans and programs which will ultimately feed into the next periodic review of prices, known as PR24, and the investment that will be made through that program between 2025 and 2030. Now, what appears to be coming back through initial draft plans and programs, including drainage and wastewater management plans, or DWMPs, and the Water Industry National Environment Programme, or WINEP, as it's catchily known as, raises 4 questions to me, at least, in terms of deliverability. The first of those relates to the balance between grey and blue-green solutions that seem to be coming through. Now, crudely, sorting the sewage mess out needs a range of actions. It needs serious upgrades to a large number of wastewater treatment works and potentially wetland treatment systems installed at some overflows. It also needs removal of surface water from combined sewers so they don't get overloaded and they don't spill as frequently. Now, the second of these in particular can be done in different ways, but it will need a combination of new storage tanks within the sewer network, so hard concrete kind of storage tanks, potentially some smart technology within the sewers to better manage the flows within those, and thirdly, the use of sustainable drainage systems, or SUDs, which you may have heard of, nature-based solutions which can manage water locally at the surface and potentially deliver a host of wider benefits, including to the quality of polluted urban runoff water. Now, when the Environment Act was passing through Parliament, many campaigners felt that a more ambitious investment programme that could be unlocked could deliver a kind of a transformational level of nature-based solutions like SUDs. These are by no means silver bullets, but they're a really important and frankly a long overlooked part of the arsenal. And that ambition was reflected in the guidance to companies from the regulators who told them to prioritise the use of catchment and nature-based solutions wherever that was feasible and appropriate. But what seems to be coming back looks many more shades of grey than green. So concrete and carbon heavy, they potentially blow the water industry's net zero plans out of the water. And the reasons for this relate to the rigidity of the laws and the targets that have come out under the Environment Act 2021 and water companies' risk aversion, particularly given the intense spotlight that they're now under and they know they're under. And because of this, they're leaning very heavily on approaches that they know and they can trust, both from a performance, and by that I mean regulatory compliance, and a cost certainty perspective. The second issue is the scale of investment needed to turn this around. Now, the WINEP programme, which fed into the last investment round, so PR19, was a £4.8 billion programme of environmental improvement works nationally. In response to the Environment Act and what's come out of it, it appears that some individual water companies' proposed programmes alone are considerably larger than the previous national programme. So we're potentially looking at a WINEP 4 to 5 times the size of the previous one. And of course, when we talk about river health, the pollution side of it is just one of the aspects. A large part also relates to water resources and the amount of water that's taken out of rivers and aquifers to provide for public, business and industry needs. If you factor in significant leakage reduction, new regional water transfers, reservoirs, desalination, metering and efficiency programs, suddenly water isn't cheap anymore. And that's something that ministers and Ofwat have always been really, really keen to maintain. So there's a big question over whether they're now going to be comfortable with the numbers that their legislation and policy is now driving through those plans. The third question is who pays for all of this and can we make it affordable? Now, the question of who pays seems to be one that has been fudged, dodged, or frankly fantasized about in the kind of public discourse. The notion that historic excessive shareholder dividends can be clawed back and used to lessen the impact of this financially is pretty fanciful, right? That money is long gone. So the storm overflows plan that government published last year suggests that the average bill impact of what it saw was a £56 billion programme of investment out until 2050 would, between the years 2025 and 2030, be roughly £12 a year on the average annual bill. And yet the bill impacts coming through potentially as a result of the latest WINEP programmes that have been proposed could in some places be over £300 a year. With the average water bill at about £420 a year, that is a whopping increase. And because storm overflows aren't evenly distributed geographically, that burden will fall far harder on some water company customers than others. And the bitter irony is here that a good number of those regions with the most storm overflows are often old industrial heartlands with high levels of social deprivation. Now, research shows that £100 extra a year on a household bill could tip about 1.2 million more people into poverty. So rather than, as rumours suggest, government is considering trimming the scale of investment, the financial burden could actually be balanced a bit more equitably. Now, if you think about it, whilst we're all local water customers, we do travel around recreationally to use rivers and beaches. We all have a stake in this at a national level. We need a just transition to cleaner rivers. So a nationally consistent social tariff to support customers struggling to pay bills was something that the previous Secretary of State was open to introducing. Now, the current one apparently isn't. Right now, you're at the whim of what your company chooses to make available, and it can go from 90% off a vulnerable customer's bill to negligible on opposite sides of the same street, which fall into different water company areas. So the final point and final question is whether it can be delivered that quickly from a practical standpoint. So many have questioned the ambition level of the storm overflows plan. 2050 is a long time to wait to clean up storm overflows. But if you take money out of the equation for a moment, the other challenge is literally how many boots and shovels can be got on the ground to actually deliver massively bigger programs than before when there's an all-round skills and capacity crunch and there's competition for labour from other major infrastructure projects. What needs to be done, and particularly if you factor in those things like leakage reduction programs too, is essentially replumbing big swathes of a lot of towns and cities. Now that is a lot of street works, a lot of engineering, a lot of disruption, a lot of people to be hired, and that is a really live concern for a number of companies simply in terms of speed of physical delivery. Sarah, 20 seconds more, I promise. So the so what really question, to many campaigners out there, this is going to sound like a shed load of excuses when really they feel like they've heard enough and they're sick of being lied to and sick of being paid lip service to. But there's some very real practical challenges here around how we make up for decades, and it really is decades stretching back way before privatisation, of political ambivalence on water and industry underinvestment and asset sweating. The harsh reality is we can't correct that in 5 to 10 years. What has to be done quickly and decisively is to agree as a society what we really want to achieve on water, how we want to achieve it, and how we want to make that affordable. Then we have to turn the tide and establish a strong and very publicly visible trajectory of improvement. Thank you. Sorry for overrunning.
No, it's quite all right. It's thanks, Alistair. If I could ask Amy and Ali to join us back again on the virtual stage, thank you very much. No, I'll let you off because they were really good points, but yes, you did recognise that we had gone a little bit over time. So what I'm going to do, instead of having, we were going to have a quick panel discussion, but we've got so many questions and interesting points coming in that I think we'll go to those straight off, and we can always add some questions if we run out of questions, which I think is very unlikely. I do want to address one right at the beginning because Geoffrey Lean has put, Sarah, you were Director of the Environment at Water UK for 7 years. Why did you and your colleagues let this crisis develop? Answer, why do you think I left? Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Let's move on to some of the perhaps more important questions in here. Jason Murugezu has asked, what is the most overlooked issue by the media on agricultural pollution in rivers? Great question. Who'd like to take that? Show of hands. Amy?
Yeah,
thank
I can
you.
go first.
Fantastic.
I mean, I think we're starting to see the agricultural pollution issue starting to take hold in the media, but ultimately I think we need to see more. We need to see more exposure of that agenda, that issue. You know, according to Environment Agency statistics, agricultural pollution is the most damaging sector to our waterways. You know, this week we filed for a judicial review at River Action to take the Environment Agency to court over their failure to apply the farming rules for water, which, you know, is really good legislation that would essentially, you know, stop a lot of agricultural pollution getting into our waterways. And I think there is a real big role for the media to play in kind of really exposing that agenda. We've seen a huge amount of exposure of the sewage pollution agenda, and I think there's a real big role for the media to play to just highlight that issue. Generally, there's a lot of work being done on that, a lot of citizen scientists out on the ground testing for phosphates and nitrates, and we need to see that evidence come through.
Right, thank you very much. There's a point I think that's related to that, building on that, from David Elliott in the chat about urban runoff, and he makes the point that we talk a lot about agricultural runoff, we talk a lot about chemical, but actually urban runoff is a significant contributory factor, and this is something we're all guilty of. So any thoughts on that from anyone? I mean, it's not highlighted, is it, Alistair?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I think it's really interesting. I personally think it's the one of the next big things to come out. If you look at the reasons for why water bodies fail to achieve good status, you know, roughly it's 40% of the water industry, 40% agriculture, and about just under 20% is urban diffuse pollution, and a lot of that is highway runoff, and within highway runoff, you know, you've got plastics, you've got heavy metals, you've got hydrocarbons, and people talk about combined sewers. When we think about sewage pollution, it's all about combined sewers and combined sewer overflows. And one of the solutions that was discussed a lot when this really hit the headlines was sewer separation. So we put the foul sewage through treatment works, and everything else in a completely separate pipe can then just go off to watercourses. But obviously, with a lot of surface water drains anyway coming off highways, that's what happens. And when you get long periods of dry weather, a lot of deposition of these pollutants on hard surfaces, you don't actually need much rain to deliver a really concentrated first flush off these hard surfaces down into highway drains. And if those receiving waters are really low in flow, the impact of that can be really, really significant on the local ecology in those water courses. So it's a massive issue. I don't think it's getting enough coverage, and I think its time will come in that context.
Brilliant, thank you. A question from Archana Sivakumar. How do you think plastic and microplastic pollution could be reduced and remediated in the rivers of London? Who'd like to add? Amy.
I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, I think the first thing is, well, microplastics is part of an emerging threat to our rivers that isn't monitored through our water quality testing regime, through kind of our regulatory process. So I think the first thing that we could do is include some of these emerging pollutants in water quality testing regime to understand what's out there and understand how we can reduce those emerging pollutants. The second is to remember that we get those pollutants into our rivers through the spreading of sewage pollution, sludge and agricultural sludge to the land as well. So if we can actually enforce, get an enforcement agency to actually enforce the current regulation as it is, I think we stand a good chance in reducing some of these emerging pollutants as well, which aren't monitored. So we need to monitor them first at the very, very basic level in order to make sure that we have regulatory instruments to start to kind of tackle those issues.
Thanks very much. That's great. And I suppose on a related issue, there was a question from Wendy Blythe asking, I'm surprised that no one on the panel has mentioned the issue of balancing the need and access to cleaner rivers with river ecosystems and wildlife having rights. Now, as you quite rightly mentioned, Amy, that there's been a huge upsurge in interest. I mean, maybe driven through COVID and lockdown and the value that we put on our wildlife spaces, but there is a balance, isn't there, between public access, and we see this in the landscape, from the landscape's point of view as well, more widely, access to nature, access to countryside and wildlife and biodiversity need to be left alone, really.
I think my response to that in some ways is, we actually have very little access to our waterways. I think we have access to about 3% of waterways. And I think the removal of people from the environment is actually having a really detrimental effect on how we value it. So, there's a lot of research and body and a lot of campaign groups working on this agenda that's actually like, well, if you give people access to that, to nature and the environment, they become custodians of that environment as well, and learn how to take part in it. So I think this kind of notion of removing people from the environment and kind of this conflict, yes, there will be conflict, but giving the space, collective space to these environments as a whole will help us to protect and restore it.
Thanks. Thank you ever so much. Look, I don't want to make it just direct all the questions at you, Amy. I mean, Ali, there's a question here from Maxwell Iamba, a couple of comments and about minoritized communities and access to healthy nature and the benefits that nature brings. From my experience, he says, it appears these environmental issues are excluding groups that really suffer from water pollution and yet pay huge sums of water bills, but are powerless to hold these big companies accountable. I mean, I guess that may be one for you and for Alistair. How do we make sure that this isn't just a white middle class passion, but the people who are suffering most and getting the least out of their bills are being heard the least as well?
Yeah, I think I would recognise that there are large numbers of people that don't have good access to a healthy environment, be that terrestrial or rivers and the coast. And I mentioned earlier that one of the underpinning features of the Water Framework Directive is that cost-benefit analysis and the way that it takes into account the benefits that the water environment provides when it's determining the targets, the ambitions, and justifying the investment in making those improvements. At the moment, I think we could say that doesn't fully take into account all of the benefits that the water environment does provide, and the sort of access and recreation components could be sort of factored into that more heavily, which would help us to justify some of that investment. A lot of the sort of focus when we think about polluted waterways and improving them for their ecology might be on rural headwaters, places which have fantastic biodiversity. But it's equally important to invest in our urban rivers, because those are the places that are close to where lots of people live and where they could access these environments. And just with the terrestrial environment, there are very few places where absolutely zero access is tolerable. I think it's a case of managing the impacts, and as Amy said, bringing people into these environments so that they connect more with our natural world and value it. I think this has knock-on implications as well. Our water industry is required to develop business plans, which Alistair spoke about earlier, and a key component of that is customer engagement. So Ofwat, the economic regulator, seek demonstration that customers agree with and support the kind of investment that the water companies are planning to make in enhancing their water environment. And if customers don't connect with our waters, don't provide that backup to the the proposals that the companies are putting forward, then it can be much harder for them to demonstrate that there is that level of support in making investment in making these improvements. And we see often very low numbers of people responding to water company consultations. I mean, it's not something that most people do. So there isn't that easy route of demonstrating that the public really want these improvements to be brought forward.
Very good point. Thanks, Ali. Ruth, I haven't forgotten. I've seen both of your questions, and we'll come to those right at the end because I think they're good questions for the end of the seminar. Rob Comrie from Chester Zoo gives an example of how Chester Zoo raised concerns with local water company about discharge of sewage into the River Dee, and he's now part of a River Dee task force. And his question is, what more can be done to encourage water companies to set up similar task forces supported by local conservation and environmental NGOs across the UK to tackle river pollution? And it goes back to this point, I think, doesn't it, of working in partnership. No one has the money or the time or the effort to be able to provide a single solution. But often when you're trying to put catchment partnerships together, somebody's money runs out, so the whole thing implodes, and then you've got to start again. And yet if you sat everybody around the table, probably that everybody wants some very similar outcomes for the different pots of money that they have. Alistair, perhaps I could ask you that one.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I think it's really important that where stakeholders have an interest, they do get in touch with their water companies. I think government needs to do a lot more in terms of enabling, driving forward these kind of collaborative initiatives and partnership working. It's something that through the catchment-based approach has been demonstrated can be really, really effective, and the more local stakeholders that are engaged in that process, the more the wider the diversity of needs and perspectives can be brought into developing solutions. Generally, the better those solutions are. The more people that get involved in delivering them, the harder that process can often become. And so it does need to be properly enabled, properly resourced. We've talked about plans. There is a potentially a holistic water plan due from government soon, and I would really like to see some additional weight added to that, the right duties to cooperate with wider communities put on the right organisations, so that those engagements really work both ways effectively, to really enable this kind of engagement. Because at the moment, I don't think it's properly aligned. I don't think legal duties work properly in all directions. And so sometimes for certain organisations who don't have that legal mandate or requirement to engage in partnership working, it can be incredibly difficult actually for them to justify it within the wider sphere of their own areas of activity and remits. So this is one big thing that I would really like to see government push harder. There seems to be a growing sort of body of evidence and consensus that it needs to happen. The kind of concept has been proved through the catchment-based approach. I think it needs now to be built up. Now, how that actually happens in practice, I don't know whether it's more resource to catchment partnerships or more resource to a public body that actually has the mandate to require different partners to collaborate properly. I don't know, but I mean, if I was the water minister, I'd have civil servants to work that all out for me. I definitely want to see more of that happening.
Yeah, thank you. You've kind of touched on my final question, which is going to be, if you were water minister, what would you do? But helpful. I'll come back to you to that. I'll hold you to a bit more of that towards the end of the session. But I've got one from Replanet UK, and this is specifically for Ali. Wildlife Trust has said they could urge millions of their members to take to the streets in direct action in the current attack on nature, with plans building for demonstrations at Parliament from April the 21st. Will Wildlife Trust be putting this call out to members? And what do you think the role of direct action has to play in the ecological crisis? And there's actually a similar question about, I saw a little bit earlier about, so many questions coming, I can't keep on top of them, about citizen science and how we can help or give citizen scientists more agency in some of the work that you and both Amy have mentioned. So Ali, could I come to you about that first question, then maybe ask you about the question about citizen science? How can we give more power to the citizen science elbow? Ali first, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, we are quite conscious that within the Wildlife Trusts we have a large number of members that we can draw upon to help support with some of these aspects, and the same could be said for a number of our other ENGO partners, such as the RSPB and the National Trust, and many of us have been active, very active around the recent attack on nature. That's not something that we think has completely disappeared. We're particularly concerned about the retained EU law bill and the impact that that could have on our environmental protections, and we're continuing to draw upon the support of our membership to help raise awareness about those risks. In terms of sort of direct action, we had been supporting Chris Packham's team, who were looking to put together a sort of large public event. I don't think there's a definite date for that currently. There have been various changes to the proposed programme in order to make sure that we can be really responsive to what's happening within government. But when the time is right for that kind of activity, definitely something that we will be supporting.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Amy, the role of the citizen scientist.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's first important to remember that the role of the citizen scientist isn't to replace the regulator when we're talking about monitoring and evaluation and holding people to account, but it does have a really, really powerful role in mobilizing communities around the agenda and really lifting this agenda on a particularly local scale and increasing the impact and awareness. And highlighting the issue at a national scale. And I think part of the question was around how do we kind of lift the results of the citizen scientists up to be more impactful. And I think it's about, what we're doing at River Action is kind of supporting and serving those community groups to kind of bring that data together and really highlight it to the regulators, the Environment Agency, Ofwat, DEFRA, etc., to make sure that that data is feeding through into kind of impactful change. And I think that's the role of some of the other, the big national NGOs and people working in this space, is to really support those citizen scientists. And we know that the Rivers Trust are working on what they call the CABA approach. Or Costco, but that's a very long-term project, and what we need is consistency in what people are doing. So we know we've got the river fry monitoring, we need sort of standardized methods of approach, and we need them really quickly so that we can use that data in an informed way that is taken seriously by both the industry and the regulators. And I think we have a really big role to play in that.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I guess David Murphy's question kind of pulls out even further from that, and is the issue bigger and wider than what water companies can deliver and their customers can afford? Is it time to rethink our relationship, use and management of water in homes and communities, and how government and regulators can make that happen? And we do often talk, so often when we're talking about policy making, of the silo approach. So are we really linking up what comes out of people's taps with what ends up in the river, what you throw away to what ends up in terms of pollution and the food we eat? There's a question about high nutrient food, which we'll get to in a second, but it's a good challenge, isn't it? Are we really looking at this from I hate that word holistic, but a holistic point of view to help people make the right decisions all the way through the water journey? Alistair.
Yeah, no, we're not absolutely not thinking of it in that way. Fundamentally, what happens to our rivers, to our seas, is in such a big way a result of choices we make about what happens on land. So, you know, how we farm, how sustainably we build, how we maintain and invest in our infrastructure, and that's infrastructure in the widest sense. So I was talking about roads earlier. That needs to improve dramatically across the board. And that means water being a fundamental consideration in a lot more policy areas. So, you know, at the moment, the kind of DEFRA sphere of influence seems to be just going around and cleaning up the mess that has been created because we haven't thought about water in enough policy areas. It's been a battle, I think, for DEFRA across the years to really be heard against some of the other, you know, much more effective campaigning areas of industry, of activity. And I think the realization is coming that, you know, that reality over decades has had a really disastrous impact on the health of our water, and it needs to change. And I think the kind of measures that are coming forward in the environmental improvement plans that hopefully you'll see some evidence of in a you know, a holistic plan for water. They won't be able to fix it overnight. This is quite a cultural change, I think, for policymakers and decision makers. But I think I see evidence of the thinking and the language changing. And I said earlier, you know, we need to work out what we need to do, how we want to do it, and how quickly we need to go, and what that looks like. And yeah, it feels like I think everybody really getting an understanding of the impacts of what everyday aspects of life have on water. And a massive part of that, I think, is, you know, touching on one of the points that Amy made earlier, is access to nature and really seeing it and valuing it. Because if we can't do that, then we're never going to break this kind of vicious cycle. Yes,
and I would certainly, from my experience on the Glover review of protected landscapes, you know, there are parallels between you know, the people who are the most minoritized or find it most difficult to get access to nature are the people who are also paying for it. You know, everybody's a water bill payer, everybody's a taxpayer, and there is sometimes a feeling, well, certainly I felt that quite strongly, that there is a certain section of society who are being essentially cross-subsidized by everybody else, many of whom simply don't get access to the spaces that they're entitled to. There's been, Alistair, I wonder while I've got you, but Amy and Ali, you might want to jump in on this. There's been a lot of chat about cuts to not just the EA, but other regulatory bodies, the siloed thinking that you've just mentioned, Alistair. Do you think we're in a good place in terms of Environment Agency funding? And if not, then what do we need to do? And I said, Amy and Ali, you may want to, I don't want to make it, it's difficult to think, oh gosh, you've just said that, so I should build on that. So Alistair, if I could ask you that first, and then maybe Amy and then Ali.
No, I mean, I think the very quick and easy answer to that is I don't think regulators are resourced anywhere near enough, or environmental protection agencies. The bottom line is the environment cannot protect itself, and particularly where you have strong corporate interests, strong corporate drivers, and the obvious example is water companies and the need to regulate that properly. But it extends right across the economy and other polluters, and you know, development interests and all of that kind of thing. There's the tragedy of the commons, isn't there? And I think this whole way in which the environment has been undervalued, water has been undervalued, has led to this chronic decline in its health. And really the only way that we can turn that tide is to protect it properly and regulate for it properly. And I think we need to see dramatic increases in the level of funding and capacity for our environmental regulators. It's been too low for too long, and we need to see a big switch.
Brilliant, thank you. Amy, that question, and do you think that water companies take the Environment Agency seriously?
I mean, I would back up everything that Alice has just said. It's probably taking the words out of mine and Ali's mouth to a large degree. But I mean, the other thing that I would add to that is, you know, it's enough of voluntary measures. You know, they don't work. Self-monitoring of an industry, particularly the water industry, doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. This kind of cutting of red tape. You know, who are we cutting red tape for? It's often not the environment. And then. What was the second part of the question, Sarah?
It was around the idea of the siloed thinking, and is there enough funding for Environment Agency and other regulators more generally?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, we've seen a slashing in the Environment Agency's budget. What by some varies, you know, estimates vary between 50 and 70% over, you know, the last 10 years. And how can you possibly, you know, enforce regulation if you don't have the boots on the ground to do that? You know, we've seen through, you know, we see in farm inspections are what, we've got enough farm inspectors to inspect every 6 generations or something like. I mean, that's just not good enough. How are we supposed to hold polluters to account or ensure that they're meeting their targets and you know, ultimately doing the things that they're being paid public money to do? So yeah, I'll just back up everything Alistair said. Probably Ali's got some further comments, thoughts.
Brilliant, thank you. Ali, question number 1, are regulatory agencies funded adequately? And question number 2, do water companies take the Environment Agency seriously?
So on the regulatory funding, as Amy and Alistair have already said, we've seen significant cuts in Environment Agency budgets, and we've seen some of the implications of that. I think to sort of add to that, we have, where we've seen very recently some additional funding for the Environment Agency for farm inspections in particular, we're seeing really good results coming out of that. The agency are able to go and engage with farmers on the ground, make them aware of issues which they might not have sort of realised were a problem, and guide them in ways in which way they can tackle those. And then with the enforcement option as a fallback where that doesn't work, that seems to be quite a positive sort of method of starting to turn these things around. And we know that, you know, we can't have full compliance with all of the regulation overnight. This is going to be a time that needs to be taken to sort of bring people up to standard. I'd say in addition to that, the biodiversity crisis is obviously heavily linked in to the state of our water environment. And one of the things that the Environmental Audit Committee said in their recent inquiry into water quality in rivers was that improving the state of the water environment is going to be integral to achieving the targets within the Environment Act to halt the decline of biodiversity. So we need to see much closer working between the regulators dealing with the sort of water quality side and everyone dealing with the biodiversity side. Again, that's one of those sort of silos that we can potentially face. And a great example is we will have local nature recovery strategies across England. We have catchment partnerships across England. They should really be integral to each other in terms of delivering benefits for our water environment. In terms of the water companies and their relationship with the Environment Agency, yeah, I think we do need to see, in some instances, that much clearer separation between the sort of regulatory approach that is required. But I think in other aspects, there are true benefits of that closer sort of partnership working. So there are some aspects where bringing the Environment Agency, the water industry, local authorities and others together leads you towards solutions which you might not otherwise have come up with. So I think there is a fine line to tread in terms of that relationship between regulator and regulatee, and it's a difficult one, and I think it can go wrong very easily, but I think there are benefits to that partnership working as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask you the final question. I'm going to ask you is, what would you do if you were water minister? So I'll give you 2 whole sentences on that, but I do want to get a quick couple of questions in around solutions. Brian DeCal has mentioned tuber technology. Is that going to help? And we had quite a long chat in the chat about nature-based solutions. Now, from my experience as a journalist looking at nature-based solutions, so this was some time ago, I do remember that it's the problem is the next bit of funding. It's all very well you get the funding for 3 or 4 years. What happens to the next 5 and the next 10? And do you have community support to keep them going and all that sort of thing? So really quickly, if I may go around the table just to have a little, just get your sense of what you think the possible solutions that are already on the table could be. Alistair, can I start with you?
Okay, on nature-based solutions, I think we've only just scratched the surface of what's possible there. I think the challenge there is the time that they take to mature and deliver the outcomes that they're designed to deliver, and the data underpinning that performance. When set aside to very traditional engineered solutions, and the certainty, the experience of the latter just means it's too easy to fall back on those kind of things. I think we need to be brave, we know nature-based solutions work, even if we don't know exactly how much and in what, over what time scale. We need to look at really making that as widely applied as possible.
Brilliant, thank you. Amy?
More beavers, maybe. I think they're proven to work. They're out there. We need to stop being afraid of these sort of what we call apex predators or whatever we're calling them, and really start to kind of widespread, increase the diversity of our solutions that we're thinking about in terms of nature-based solutions. And my chief executive will love me for saying that. And
I think I read somewhere there is actually a tourism boost as well from introducing beavers. I may have just dreamt that, but I'm pretty sure I saw somewhere that there is actually a definable economic benefit from the associated tourism. Ali?
That leads on to my suggestion quite nicely. One of the benefits that have been seen from a number of beaver reintroductions are not only the potential flood risk benefits, which you might expect, holding water back in times of high flow, but also holding water back in times of low flow. So during the summer droughts, we were seeing that areas with beavers, and equally areas with wetland habitat, whether beaver created or not, were much better able to hold on to water in those times of heat and low flows. And I think water resources is going to be one of the key areas that the Minister will need to look at. There's been so much focus on water pollution, the water quality side of the picture, but water quantity is something we really need to be thinking more about. We know that in England, for example, we use something like 14,000 megalitres per day of water at the moment. And if we don't take any action by 2050, we're going to need to find an additional 4,000 megalitres per day. So in terms of the extra proportion, that's hugely significant. And so we need to make sure that we are, planning really effectively for future water needs and putting things in place now that mean we don't need to find those additional water resources in the future, because it's not something that our environment can sustain.
Brilliant, thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much, everybody. Before we just ask our very final question, which you now have one sentence for, I'm afraid, but thank you so much for amazing set. I thought this would be the case. Amazing chat, amazing question and answers, which have been being answered by other people on the seminar. So thank you so much. I'm so sorry we didn't get to everything. We could have extended this by another hour and a half and still not actually addressed all the questions in the chat. So thank you so much for that. So, final sentence, in the same order. If you were water minister, what was the first thing you would do with your civil servants assembled? What is the first thing that you would say? Alistair?
Slightly different tack: ban plastics in wet wipes. The prevalence of wet wipe reefs in TV and in sewage litter, why hasn't it been done already?
Thank you. Amy?
I'd say 3 things: enforce the law, fund the regulators, and start applying appropriate hard-hitting fines.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Ali?
I think I would have to say, think much more about how our land management impacts our water environment. Agriculture is obviously a huge component, but we've also talked today about urban pollution. And we know that the state of our rivers are highly dependent on what happens on land, and we just don't connect the two enough. Maybe the forthcoming land use framework will help with that to some extent.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody on the call. Thank you to all our questioners. And I'm so sorry we didn't get to speak about everything that you mentioned in the chat. As I said, we could have had another hour for this. Thank you so much to Alistair, to Ali and to Amy for brilliant questions and just answering everything I threw at you. And thank you so much to Green Alliance for hosting at some speed, hosting this seminar, which I hope you found as diverting and fascinating as I did with the answers that we got from the questions as well. Until next time, whenever that may be, thank you very much indeed, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.